Good evening, Dr. Croston. As always, I am grateful to say that I do greatly appreciate the time to come and give a presentation. I also want to say uh, welcome to my classmates and to everybody that will be taking the time to listen to this presentation. Today, I'll be talking about Pan-Africanism and the politics of identity in Central Africa with the Zambian perspective. As you all know, Zambia is a country in Southern Africa, or as somebody would want to be very specific, in South Central Africa. uh, I would want to start first by looking at what Pan-Africanism, the movement, what it really is, and what it stands for. Because I know that many of you do understand, do know what Pan-Africanism is, but I know that some people might not be very convincing with what Pan-Africanism is. Pan-Africanism is an ideology and a movement that encourages the solidarity of Africans worldwide. It is based on the belief and the moral values that unity is vital to economic, social, and political progress. It aims to unify and uplift people of African descent. The ideology asserts that the fate of all African peoples and countries are intertwined. At its core, Pan-Africanism is, and I quote, a belief that African peoples, both on the continent and in the diaspora, share not merely a common history but a common destiny. It is from this angle, from this perspective, that I want to be able to look at the contents of Pan-Africanism and its contribution to to African democracy, the way of life in terms of culture and social development, especially after the post-colonial era, into what is now known as the modern-day democratic Africa. Pan-Africanist ideas first began to circulate in the mid-19th century, as you all know, in the United States. Yes, in the United States. And probably I have come to realize that I think this is one of the reasons why Pan-Africanism itself in Africa never really worked. It was a baby born from the it is what I consider as something like a baby born from the outside world that never really was nurtured in the in the African way, in terms of the political thought, in terms of the cultural, social, economic thought. It was never nurtured in that way, and I believe this is why this movement, the ideology behind the movement of Pan-Africanism, was so weak and was unable to actually contribute and uplift the true values of Africa. As I said, in the mid-19th century, Pan-Africanism is born in the United States, led by Africans, of course, from the Western Hemisphere. The most important early Pan-Africanists were Martin Delany and Alexander Crummell, both African Americans, and of course with Edward Blyden, from the West Indies. Pan-Africanism itself is the truth of history. So many African researchers would want to call it, scholars would want to frame it, and especially the politicians of modern day history, Africa would want to call it that. We need to understand first that the development of Africa through Pan-Africanism itself being initiated by by a movement, a social movement, which of course was meant to be a political movement in the context of in the context of bringing development to Africa, began from the outside of the African continent. Several meetings took place, for instance, in Chicago Conference on Africa in 1895. That's how far backwards how far in history Pan-Africanism began in the United States, and this was the time before it actually began coming to to Africa. And this is the time when African leaders themselves are actually trying to understand, to learn about politics in general, trying to learn about self-governance, self-rule. They're still under the oppression and the yoke of the pre-colonial masters. That is the British, the French, and some other countries that were, other countries that were actually colonizing Africa during that time. You see, so what at that time, during the 1900s, of course, many Africans are still being sold as slaves. And during this time, the African Americans here that experience part of the slavery, the evils of slavery, are trying to come together to form this organization, this movement that is going to see their liberation from the United States, from America, from the Americas, so that they can have freedom in the worlds beyond the ocean, so to say. And now, 1885, the Atlanta Congress in Africa. 1895, the Pan-African Conference. 1900, the first Universal Race Conference in London. 1911, the Pan-African Congress by W.E.D. Du Bois. 1919, again, there is another Pan-African conferences that continue to be held until 1927. And then there were the Marcus Garvey Universal Negro Movement Association conventions between 1920 and 1925. Most of these and other conferences and congresses were fruitful and well noted. However, the point that I'm coming to is that the formation of the African movement begins in the United States. It begins in the Americas by oppressed Africans who are experiencing the upheavals of slave trade. You see, now these are people who believe that by migrating and moving to back to Africa, because they are Africans and they believe that they belong to Africa, they will need to organize in unity and move to Africa so that they can be able to begin to develop the continent where they believe they originated from. And that means they have to develop the African continent in terms of political integration, economic integration, social integration, cultural integration, and to make it like the United States of Africa. So they believed. And during this time, by the late 1940s, the African American intellectual leadership of the movement had receded, with Africans now taking the lead. Remember, with the Africans taking the lead. And when we talk about the Africans taking the lead now, we are looking at the Pan-Africanist newborn leaders, so to say, like Kwame Nkrumah, or former leader of Ghana. We are looking at President Kasonde of Zambia, Julius Nyerere, Milton Obote. I wouldn't talk about Mandela so much because during this time Mandela is also fighting the apartheid in South Africa. And we are looking at all these leaders, Patrice Lumumba. Of course, we are talking of the Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe. And these are leaders that now are coming in the forefront to try to spearhead the movement of the Pan-Africanist in Africa, because they believe that with the Western type of governance, which in fact was not even so much precipitated by the African Americans that were trying to move to Africa in order to govern Africa at that time, because technically speaking, they were like leaders within the civil rights movement, and they had little knowledge about governance. They had little knowledge about democracy. They had little knowledge about the political arena, or what we might as well, refer to as political experience in the political world, political science. They had very little knowledge about that. And here they are, they are trying to spearhead this movement. In the 1940s and the early 50s, the United States was in the midst of a Red Scare, when Americans with communist affiliations or sympathies were actively persecuted or prosecuted. The most important figure of this period was Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, who believed that European colonial rule of Africa could be extinguished if Africans could unite. Remember, like I said, everybody is now beginning to think like, because African Americans in the United States are experiencing the upheavals of slave trade, segregation, and well, in a way, some form of apartheid, like it existed in South Africa, and now they're trying to put this sort of Pan-Africanism together, that if we can establish our own place, our own continent, then if we can get back to Africa, because that's where the roots of they believe all Africans originated from, then we can be able to establish that continent. It has got natural resources, it has got everything that is needed to make it a strong continent and be able to defend itself, and at the same time compete on the international stage as a free continent, instead of having Africans from Africa living in diaspora and experiencing all these problems that come with segregation and so to say. In the midst of the most important figure of this period was Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, who believed that European colonial rule of Africa could be extinguished if Africans could continue politically and economically. Nkrumah went on to lead the movement of independence in Ghana, which came to fruition in 1957. Many African Americans cheered those developments in Africa, because as the African Americans were trying to move this forward, and Kwame Nkrumah actually achieved something. They now begin to think like, "Oh wow, it's working. But no, it's not. Why? Like I said in my initial remarks, this is a Western baby, so to say. This is a Western baby. It's more. This is a Western movement based on frustration, based on political identity, social identity, cultural identity. So it's not a movement that is born out of principle. It is a movement that I think is born out of frustration. Yeah, it's a movement that is born out of frustration. Therefore, Pan-Africanist cultural thinking reemerged with renewed force in the United States in the late 1960s and 70s. And I could keep on referring to the United States because by doing so, I want to create this basis, this foundation, that if you understand the origin of Pan-Africanism in the United States, if you understand where this organization, this movement begins, then you understand why in Africa it had very little impact in impacting African countries. You begin to understand that Pan-Africanism itself, starting from the Western world in the Americas, because of mistreatment of some Africans, who now then begin to think that we need a place of our own, is a movement born out of frustration, and therefore it's not in principle. And I don't think that anything born out of frustration will have a mark on the on the African continent, because to establish unity, you need to have a strong government, you need to have strong economic backbone, you need to have political integration among African countries, and you need to bring all those cultures, different ethnic groups together. You need to integrate and to make a strong Africa. So this movement is already already shaken even before it spreads to Africa. By the early 1970s, it had become relatively common for African Americans to investigate their African cultural roots. And because with that in mind, they have the hope that if they can identify where they come from, then they can take that they can take and spearhead the movement to that part of Africa. Now, outside of the African continent, several meetings take place again, and when this Pan-Africanism comes to Africa, you've got a situation where there is already traditional leadership taking place in Africa, in many different parts of Africa. And traditional leadership with Western type of leadership at that time could not reconcile. It was not compatible in a way, because the traditional leadership of many African countries believed that the Western leadership, political leadership in a way, was based on theocracy. It was based on autocratic kind of government, where people were subjected to do what they were told. It was more of a dictatorship in a way, kind of governing, where African people had no say. They were obliged to do what they were taught, what they were commanded to do, whatever the whatever the pre-colonial governments subjected the African governments at that time, their subjects to do, they had to do it without any question. So now you see there is this traditional leadership in Africa that is that perceives the colonial governments, the imperial governments, as governments that are out there to actually impose their iron rule on the African continent, And now, when these when Pan-Africanism begins to spread to Africa, there is a problem there, right there. There is a problem right there, because then people begin to think that by adopting these Western values, it's going to work much better by overriding the traditional type of leadership. Now, we've got a situation where the already existing African political environment system that is existing there, where people believe that in order to elect somebody to office, probably has to be an elderly person that has been living in that community, knows the tradition, knows the principles, they understand the values of the people, they have been there, to help the people. For example, the big man politics, like the big man politics in Africa, where this person understands the community, understands the people, they have got connections that people can rely on. And now here comes, probably for, I would use the Kwame Nkrumah example. He's well educated now, and he's coming now from the West, and he's got these Pan-African ideologies that he has acquired from the West, and and now they want to begin to spread that. Yes, it did work in a way, because, for example, not only the establishment of the Organization of African Unity, it was quite persuasive in a way. It was quite effective in a way, because through this, African leaders began to realize that they had the potential to act, that through through the unification of Africa, they had the potential to begin to solidify the integration of Africa, of African economic integration, political integration, and also trying to bring their cultures and social integration together. And in doing so, Pan-Africanism itself had some influence in that area, because then people started learning, people started coming together and to understand that, with Africa, with Pan-Africanism, we can actually build a strong Africa. But the problem again is on the traditional part of Africa, on the traditional side of the African political system now, which believe that the West side, the Western side of politics is wrong, because many colonial masters are there to rule Africa and to destabilize their social order in terms of traditions and values, including the principles that the African political system is based on, where the elders are actually respected, and those that have connections, like the big man politics. In the big man politics, can only understand the values of the people and help the people to actually pursue their success in an impoverished environment. Again, the Pan-Africanists didn't sit so well with many of the majority of the people, because they looked at it as a failure of a movement. They looked at it. Many people looked at Pan-Africanism as a failed movement, a failed movement that began from the Americas by frustrated people. So people now had a problem of integrating the Pan-Africanism with traditional political system, the traditional political system of many African countries. Many African countries thought like it was the Western side of the political system that was gonna overtake them, uh, take over their principles and values of how a true traditional African political system should be based on. So now that we've got two ideologies in both in principle and in theory, actually conflicting against each other. They seem not to be compatible. Where with Pan-Africanism, there is some form of unity that is coming. And at the same time, in a traditional sense of African politics, there is already some ethnic divisions that is going on. So, on the other hand, you're looking at Pan-Africanism as saying, this is effective, this can be achievable. On the other hand, again, you've got a traditional aspect of African politics saying this cannot be compatible, this cannot work. So then how do two ideologies, two theoretical explanations of two different movements combine together in order to produce a unity for a continent that is so diverse culturally, with so many different tribes? So in that regard, Pan-Africanism could not by any means be the solution for African democracy. Pan-Africanism could not be the solution for African democracy. Yes, it had some good values, it had some good intentions, but the intentions were only in theory and not in principle. They were only in theory and not in principle, whereas African politics, had something more than theory. It was practical because people understand their system of governance. People understand their traditional system of leadership. And it is that leadership that agrees with the cultural base. It is that leadership that agrees with ethnicity. In other words, it agrees with the ethnicity. Therefore, the African continent and its politics were able to overcome the influence of Pan-Africanism, because Pan-Africanism only started with so much momentum that at the end it actually lost its influence. Well, we unity on the African continent. I don't think that unity, when you talk about Pan-Africanism, you might say that unity on the continent of Africa was because of Pan-Africanism. No, because even people under the monarchies, under their kings and chiefs and village headmen, people in Africa already somehow had unity. There was already unity that existed. What took away or destabilized the unity that people were enjoying was some, for instance, the evils of slave trade that already much started in North Africa, West Africa, and spread to South, Central Africa, other parts of Africa where people were being slaughtered. People were being sold as slaves out of Africa, to Europe, the Americas, the West Indies, and all that stuff. That's where the situation. That's where I would say the unity of Africa becomes fragile. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in a position to believe wholeheartedly that disunity in Africa was because people of Africa were never united, and that Pan-Africanism was going to cause to bring unity of the Africans in Africa, or bring development in Africa, change the political environment, the dynamics of political civil integration, economic integration in Africa. I don't believe that. I strongly argue that. My point is yes, Pan-Africanism itself had some substantial or rather significant elements that of improving and developing the democracy in Africa. It was on that aspect it had some, but then again, without the traditional political system of the African people, Pan-Africanism was not going to go far. You see, I think it's important for me to point out the strength of both Pan-Africanism and the indigenous African political system, before and even after the post-colonial era. Before the post-colonial era, Africans still had this unity where ethnically, culture-wise in Africa, people tend to respect the very essence of life. I know somebody. I gotta talk about this because I know that somebody might say, well, if that's the case, then what about Sudan? What about the situation in Sudan, and also what about Burundi and Rwanda, or in the Congo, or where ethnic tribes have been able to fight and slaughter so many thousands of people. I think that's why you need to understand that. That's why it's important for us to understand that. You see, the civil unrest, the political unrest in North Africa, is not only because of religious wars between maybe religious divide between between Islam and Christianity. Rather, is it not only because of ethnic divide in Rwanda, Burundi, or political division, ethnic political division in the Congo? I don't think so. But as like I said, there is this ideology of Pan-Africanism even within Islam, and also this Pan-Africanism within the indigenous Africa, and these are social movements, that are that had an ideology of unity, not only politically but economically, culturally, to bring Africans together. But now then, you've got a Western situation that seems not to be compatible. Thank you.